Pilot lectures black woman about flight etiquette. Seconds later, she grounds him permanently. High above the clouds, turbulence shook the plane with a ferocity that left even the most seasoned travelers gripping their armrests. In the cockpit, tension was thick, and decisions carried the weight of life and death. Amid the chaos, a passenger in first class stood up, not to panic but to take action. What no one realized, this wasn't an ordinary passenger. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now, let's get into it. The crisp morning air hung heavy with the faint hum of engines at the bustling city airport. Monica Carter adjusted the strap of her modest leather travel bag as she walked through the expansive terminal. Her dark skin glowed faintly under the fluorescent lights, her hair tied back neatly, and her casual outfit, jeans paired with a plain button-up shirt, gave her an approachable air. But behind her calm demeanor lay decades of experience as a decorated Air Force pilot, a truth she rarely needed to announce. Monica scanned the terminal signs, her eyes sharp but calm, and made her way toward the first-class check-in line. Though she had flown countless times, this would be her first commercial flight since retiring. A small smile tugged at her lips as she thought about the simple pleasure of visiting her family without the pressures of work. The thought of seeing her niece's face when she arrived was enough to make her forget the weight of her duffel bag. As Monica approached the counter, she noticed the agent's eyes flicker briefly, just a split-second glance at her outfit, her bag, and her face. The kind of glance Monica had grown accustomed to, but never fully immune to. It was the type of silent judgment she could feel more than see. "Good morning," Monica said, her voice even and polite. The agent hesitated, then smiled, the kind of practiced expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning. May I have your ticket and ID?" Monica handed over her documents without comment, watching as the agent's gaze lingered a little too long on her first-class ticket. There it was again, that flicker of doubt, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to someone who had seen it far too many times. The agent's polite smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning in full force. "Thank you, Miss Carter," the agent finally said, her tone slightly more professional, almost as if she realized Monica had caught her hesitation. "You're all set. Enjoy your flight." Monica nodded, taking her documents back. "Thank you." As she walked toward the security checkpoint, her calm demeanor remained intact, though she couldn't help the slight tightening in her chest. She told herself it didn't matter. It never did. Not when she knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. The security line moved smoothly, but Monica caught snippets of conversations around her. A family to her left chatted loudly about their vacation plans, while a young couple debated whether they should upgrade to business class. Behind her, she could feel the faint stirrings of curiosity. A low murmur from two middle-aged men who had noticed her first-class boarding pass. "First class? Didn't peg her for it," one of them muttered, just loud enough for Monica to hear. She ignored it. It wasn't worth turning around or giving them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. She had learned long ago to let such comments roll off her back, though they still left a bitter taste. After clearing security, Monica approached the first-class lounge, a serene oasis away from the chaos of the terminal. As she entered, the receptionist offered her a warmer welcome than the check-in agent had, perhaps swayed by Monica's calm confidence. She settled into a plush chair, opened her book, and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. This was what she had looked forward to, a brief escape from her meticulously planned military life. The boarding announcement came soon enough, pulling Monica out of her reverie. She gathered her belongings and walked to the gate, where the flight crew stood greeting passengers. Monica noticed the captain among them, a tall, middle-aged white man with salt and pepper hair. His posture was commanding, his smile faintly smug as he greeted passengers entering the first-class cabin. As Monica handed her boarding pass to the gate attendant, she felt the captain's eyes linger on her. When she stepped into the first-class section, the captain followed her movements closely, his expression unreadable but intense. Monica chose a seat near the window and began settling in, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She could feel the captain's gaze like a spotlight illuminating her every action. Then, just as she adjusted her bag under the seat in front of her, the captain approached. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice measured but with a faint edge. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Monica looked up, meeting his gaze evenly. "Yes, I am." The captain's eyes flickered down to her boarding pass, which she hadn't offered but had placed neatly on her tray table. His lips tightened ever so slightly before he added, "I just want to ensure everything is in order. Sometimes passengers get confused about seat assignments." His words were polite, but the implication was crystal clear. Monica allowed a pause to settle between them, her gaze unwavering. "I assure you, Captain, there's no confusion." For a moment, the captain seemed taken aback by her calm yet firm response. Then, recovering quickly, he gave a tight smile. "Of course. Well, I hope you enjoy your flight. Let us know if you need anything." Monica nodded once, her expression neutral as he walked away. But as she leaned back in her seat, she couldn't help the slight tension that coiled in her chest. This wasn't new, but it still stung. And something told her this wasn't the last she'd hear from Captain Banks. The engines roared to life as the plane began its taxi to the runway, and Monica closed her eyes, preparing for takeoff. Little did she know this flight would take her on a journey far beyond the clouds, and straight into a confrontation she hadn't anticipated. The gentle hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. Monica opened her eyes and gazed out the window, watching as the early morning clouds stretched endlessly below them. The sky was a soft, pale blue, streaked with golden light from the rising sun. It was a view she had seen countless times before, yet it never failed to strike a chord deep within her. This was home. The open skies, the vast horizons. It was where she belonged. The flight attendant approached, interrupting her thoughts. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" Monica glanced up and smiled politely. "Just water, please." The attendant nodded but seemed distracted, her eyes darting briefly to Monica's seat and then back to her face. The smile she returned was thin, almost perfunctory, as if offering anything more would cost her. Monica noticed but said nothing. She had long learned that silence could be just as powerful as words. The attendant handed her the water and moved on, giving a noticeably warmer reception to the man sitting across the aisle in a tailored suit. Monica took a sip of the cool water and focused her gaze back out the window, letting the faint tension dissipate. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. His tone was smooth and authoritative, the kind that suggested he enjoyed the sound of his own voice. He welcomed the passengers, gave a brief overview of the flight path, and announced that they were cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet. "And for our first-class passengers," he added, his voice carrying an air of superiority, "I'd like to remind you that we aim to provide the highest level of comfort and service. Please feel free to let the crew know if there's anything we can do to make your experience more enjoyable." Monica raised an eyebrow at the slightly patronizing tone. It was subtle, but there was something in his phrasing that felt less like an invitation and more like a set of instructions for behavior. She leaned back in her seat, deciding to brush it off, but a flicker of unease lingered. Half an hour later, the captain emerged from the cockpit. He walked down the aisle, his steps deliberate and his gaze scanning the cabin. His eyes landed on Monica, and his expression hardened almost imperceptibly before he approached her seat. "Good morning again," he said, his voice low but carrying enough weight to catch the attention of the passengers nearby. "I couldn't help but notice earlier. You seem unfamiliar with some of our first-class amenities. May I offer some guidance?" Monica blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the unexpected approach. She set her glass of water on the tray table and turned to face him fully. "I appreciate the offer, Captain, but I'm quite comfortable, thank you." The captain smiled tightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. I just wanted to ensure that all our passengers are aware of the etiquette and expectations we have in this cabin. It's important to maintain a certain standard, wouldn't you agree?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Monica felt the weight of several gazes now directed at her. She could sense the curiosity, the judgment, and perhaps even the silent approval from those who shared the captain's assumptions. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I'm well aware of the standards, Captain," she said evenly, her tone calm but firm. "I've traveled extensively and understand how things work." The captain's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Good to hear," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "If you need any assistance, don't hesitate to ask. Enjoy your flight." He straightened and moved down the aisle, leaving behind a subtle ripple of tension in his wake. Monica's hands tightened around the armrests of her seat as she watched him walk away. She had encountered men like him before, men who wielded authority not as a tool of leadership, but as a weapon of control, always quick to remind others of their supposed place. Across the aisle, the man in the tailored suit smirked, his eyes meeting Monica's briefly before he turned away. She caught a whispered comment from the row behind her, something about upgrades and knowing her place. The words were quiet, meant only for private consumption, but they carried just loud enough for her to hear. Monica closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to let the anger dissipate. It wasn't worth it. Not here. Not now. The plane continued on its course, the cabin settling back into the gentle rhythm of flight. Monica tried to focus on her book, but the words on the page blurred as her mind replayed the interaction. The captain's tone, his words, his very presence had carried the weight of a challenge, a test of her composure, her patience, her resolve. She had spent years in environments where respect was earned, where actions spoke louder than appearances. In the Air Force, there had been no room for doubt, no space for assumptions. Her abilities had defined her, not her skin color, not her gender, not the way she dressed or carried herself. But out here in the civilian world, those old prejudices lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. Monica leaned back, her gaze drifting once more to the window. The clouds below were thick and impenetrable, a sea of white that stretched endlessly in every direction. For the first time in years, she felt a pang of frustration, not at the captain, not at the whispers, but at the sheer exhaustion of it all. The constant need to prove herself, to rise above the pettiness and prejudice weighed heavy on her spirit. But she refused to let it show. Not here, not now. Not when she knew that her strength, her composure, her unshakable confidence were her greatest weapons. As the plane cruised on, Monica made a silent vow. She would not allow anyone, not the captain, not the passengers, not anyone, to define her or diminish her. She had faced far greater challenges in her life, and this would be no different. The faintest of smiles touched her lips as she thought of the irony. The captain might think himself an authority in the air, but he had no idea who he was lecturing. No idea at all. The flight had settled into a quiet rhythm, the faint hum of the engines providing a backdrop to the occasional clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversations in the first-class cabin. Monica had finally managed to immerse herself in her book, letting the familiar comfort of words soothe her frayed nerves. She sipped her water slowly, savoring the coolness against the dryness of her throat. Then, a slight jolt shook the cabin. It wasn't much, a subtle shudder that most passengers wouldn't have noticed, but Monica's finely tuned instincts, honed over decades in the Air Force, immediately picked up on it. She set her glass down and looked out the window, scanning the horizon. The clouds had thickened, their once soft edges now sharper, darker. A shift in atmospheric pressure was palpable, even to someone seated in the safety of the cabin. The captain's voice came over the intercom, his tone professional but slightly strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We should be through it shortly." Monica glanced around the cabin. Most passengers complied, their movements unhurried. A few exchanged nervous glances but quickly returned to their conversations or movies. Monica, however, kept her gaze fixed on the window, her fingers gripping the armrest lightly. She wasn't nervous, far from it, but her years of experience told her to remain vigilant. The plane jolted again, this time harder, the sudden movement eliciting a few gasps. Overhead compartments rattled faintly, and the seatbelt signs dinged on with a sharp, commanding tone. Monica instinctively adjusted her posture, her body leaning slightly forward, her senses now fully engaged. The turbulence grew worse, each jolt more pronounced than the last. Monica noticed the slight pitch of the plane, the way it dipped and rose unevenly, as if struggling against an unseen force. Her eyes narrowed as she mentally catalogued the possibilities. Wind shear, unexpected storm activity, perhaps even a mechanical issue. She'd encountered it all before, but this time, she was powerless to act. The flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles, checking seat belts and offering reassurances. The man across the aisle from Monica, who had earlier smirked at her, now gripped his armrests tightly, his face pale. Monica couldn't help but note the irony. Confidence, it seemed, was as fragile as glass. Then came the announcement. The captain's voice, calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, cut through the cabin. "We're experiencing a bit more turbulence than expected. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're rerouting to avoid the worst of it." Monica frowned. Rerouting? That wasn't a decision made lightly. It meant the turbulence wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a risk. Her gaze returned to the window. The clouds were now a deep, swirling gray, and she could see faint flashes of lightning in the distance. She knew what that meant. Cumulonimbus clouds, a pilot's worst nightmare. Storm cells like these were unpredictable, with strong updrafts and downdrafts capable of destabilizing even the most advanced aircraft. Another jolt, harder than before, made the cabin lurch. A drink cart rattled loudly against its restraints, and one of the overhead compartments popped open, spilling a travel pillow onto the aisle. Passengers gasped audibly, the earlier calm now replaced by unease. Monica tightened her seatbelt and sat straighter, her mind racing. The intercom buzzed on again. This time it wasn't the captain's voice, but the co-pilot's, and it carried a note of urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering severe weather ahead. Please remain calm and seated. We have the situation under control." But Monica knew better. The co-pilot's words weren't for her. They were for the passengers. A seasoned aviator like her could hear the strain beneath the reassurances. The careful choice of words meant to conceal the true gravity of the situation. As the turbulence intensified, Monica's hands rested lightly on the armrests, her body instinctively aligning with the subtle shifts of the plane. She wasn't scared. She had faced far worse in her time. But she was frustrated. Here she was, sitting helplessly while the plane navigated conditions she had mastered hundreds of times before. Then, she noticed something odd. The pitch of the engines changed. A deep, uneven whine that sent a chill down her spine. It was a telltale sign of a problem, one that no amount of turbulence could explain. The sound of struggling machinery, of systems under strain. Her instincts screamed at her to act, but she held herself back. She was just a passenger, a retired pilot with no authority here. Yet every fiber of her being urged her to get up, to take control, to do something. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm, to observe. The plane jolted violently, harder than before, throwing a few unsecured items into the aisle. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, followed by murmurs of panic. A child somewhere in the economy section began to cry, the sound cutting through the growing tension like a knife. Monica tightened her seatbelt further and braced herself, her eyes darting toward the cockpit door. If things continued like this, they might not have a choice. The captain and co-pilot would need help, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Another hard lurch sent a flight attendant stumbling into a seat, and Monica made her decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt, standing carefully despite the unsteady movements of the plane. Around her, passengers stared, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. "Ma'am, please sit down," one of the attendants called, her voice sharp with panic. Monica turned to her voice steady but firm. "I need to speak to the captain." The attendant hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. "Ma'am, you need to stay seated. It's dangerous. I understand the risks," Monica interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "But I have over 20 years of flight experience, and I know what's happening up there. They might need help." The attendant's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't move. Monica stepped forward, steadying herself against the backs of seats as the plane jolted again. She reached the cockpit door and knocked firmly, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. It was time for the captain to realize just who he was dealing with. The plane shuddered again, its structure groaning under the strain of turbulent air currents. Monica's knuckles rested firmly against the cockpit door, her body poised against the lurching movements of the aircraft. She knocked again, louder this time, each tap a deliberate assertion of her presence. Her heart remained steady, her mind already cycling through protocols and emergency scenarios. Behind her, the first-class cabin had grown tense. Passengers whispered among themselves, their expressions shifting between curiosity and fear. A flight attendant hurried toward her face pale and strained. "Ma'am," the attendant began, her voice a mix of urgency and exasperation. "I need you to return to your seat immediately. The captain is handling the situation." Monica turned to her, calm but unyielding. "I understand that you're following protocol, but I'm telling you, he might need assistance. I'm a retired Air Force pilot. I've handled emergencies like this before." The attendant blinked, caught off guard. "You're a pilot?" Monica nodded. "Yes, and if this turbulence continues to worsen, or if that engine pitch is what I think it is, they'll need all the help they can get." The attendant hesitated, torn between her training and the weight of Monica's words. Another jolt shook the cabin, nearly throwing her off balance. Monica reached out, steadying the young woman with a firm grip. "Please," Monica said, her voice quieter but no less resolute. "Just let me speak to the captain." Reluctantly, the attendant pressed a button beside the cockpit door. The small intercom panel crackled to life. "Captain Banks, there's a passenger here insisting to speak with you. She says she's a retired pilot." A long pause followed, the static-filled silence stretching uncomfortably. Monica could only imagine the conversation taking place on the other side of the door, the captain likely bristling at the idea of letting a passenger into his domain, his pride clashing with the reality of their situation. Finally, the captain's voice came through, sharp and clipped. "We're handling it. Tell her to return to her seat." Monica's jaw tightened. She expected as much, but she wasn't deterred. Leaning closer to the intercom, she spoke directly into it, her tone firm and authoritative. "Captain Banks, this isn't about stepping on your authority. It's about ensuring the safety of everyone on this plane. I've logged over 2 decades of flight time, including emergencies far worse than this. If you need assistance, I'm here." Another pause. The faint hum of the engines faltered again, that uneven whine piercing the air like an alarm only she seemed to hear. It was the sound of machinery pushed to its limits, and Monica knew time was running out. The cockpit door hissed open, revealing the narrow space beyond. Captain Banks stood there, his expression unreadable, but his posture tense. His uniform was immaculate, his captain's bars gleaming under the dim light, but there was a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. Behind him, the co-pilot glanced over his shoulder, his face pale and visibly stressed. "Come in," Banks said tersely, stepping aside to let Monica pass. His tone made it clear this was not a gesture of welcome but one of reluctant necessity. Monica entered the cockpit, the confined space instantly familiar. Rows of instruments and screens glowed with data, and the soft, rapid beeping of an alert filled the air. Her eyes scanned the panels instinctively, her mind cataloging the information with practiced precision. Altitude fluctuations, wind shear warnings, and there it was, the flashing indicator of an engine imbalance. "Severe crosswinds," Banks said, his voice tight as he gestured to the radar display. "And one of the engines is running hot. We're rerouting to avoid the worst of it, but we've lost primary communication with air traffic control." Monica nodded, already processing the situation. "And the secondary comms?" "Intermittent," the co-pilot answered, his voice strained. "We're trying to re-establish, but it's not reliable," Monica finished for him. She stepped closer to the instrument panel, her fingers hovering near the controls without touching them. "Have you checked the airflow sensors? In conditions like this, they might be feeding you bad data." Banks bristled visibly. "We've checked. This isn't our first flight." Monica met his gaze evenly. "I never said it was, but this isn't my first emergency either." Her tone carried no malice, only the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse and come out the other side. The co-pilot glanced between them, his expression a mix of unease and silent hope. Monica could feel the tension radiating from Banks, his pride warring with the reality of their situation. Another hard jolt shook the plane, the nose dipping sharply before stabilizing. Monica gripped the back of the co-pilot's chair, her stance steady. "We need to balance the thrust manually," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "The autopilot can't handle these conditions. It's overcompensating and putting more strain on the engines." Banks hesitated, his hands tightening on the controls. Monica could see the doubt flicker across his face. The conflict of a man who had spent years in control, now forced to consider the possibility that someone else might know better. "Trust me," she said quietly. "I'm not here to take over. I'm here to help." The co-pilot spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. "Captain, she might be right. The autopilot's adjustments are too erratic. We've already seen a 2% drop in thrust efficiency." Banks exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly. Without a word, he disengaged the autopilot. The plane shifted almost immediately, the manual controls responding to the finer adjustments of his hands. Monica leaned over, pointing to the engine indicators. "Ease up on the number 2 engine. Redistribute the load to 3 and 4. They're running cooler." Banks followed her instructions begrudgingly, his movements precise but reluctant. The plane's movements smoothed slightly, the violent jolts replaced by smaller, more manageable vibrations. Monica glanced at the radar, noting the storm's position relative to their new flight path. "We'll need to descend slightly to avoid the stronger wind currents," she said, her fingers tracing the weather patterns on the screen. "A lower altitude will give you more control in these conditions." Banks gritted his teeth but nodded, adjusting the plane's trajectory. The tension in the cockpit began to ease, replaced by a tentative sense of stability. For now, they were safe. But Monica knew the hardest part was still to come. The plane's descent was gradual but deliberate, the nose tilting downward as Captain Banks adjusted the thrust. The cockpit was a cacophony of sounds. Alerts chirped, engine indicators hummed, and the faint murmur of turbulence rumbled in the background. Monica remained close to the controls, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of uncertainty. Her eyes flicked to the radar again, studying the swirling mass of weather ahead. The storm's core loomed like a dark specter, its tendrils stretching out across their path. Monica could feel the weight of the situation pressing against her, but her focus remained razor-sharp. "Altitude at 28,000 feet, the co-pilot announced, his voice steadier now but still tinged with nerves. "Hold it there," Monica said, her tone calm but commanding. "Let's see if the winds stabilize." Banks didn't argue this time. He adjusted the throttle carefully, his movements precise but lacking the confident ease Monica had seen in other seasoned pilots. She could sense his reluctance to fully trust her, but the results were undeniable. The violent jolts had lessened, the plane's path smoothing out as they skirted the edges of the storm. The cockpit fell into a tense silence, broken only by the hum of machinery and the occasional crackle of static from the communication panel. Monica took the opportunity to glance at the other instruments, her practiced eye catching every detail. The engine temperatures were stabilizing, though the second engine still ran hotter than she liked. Fuel reserves were adequate, but the detour had added strain to their consumption rates. She turned to Banks, her expression neutral. "What's your plan for the approach?" He stiffened slightly, his jaw tightening. "We're heading for the alternate runway at the next nearest airport. It's shorter but closer, and they're expecting us." Monica nodded. "Good, but keep in mind that with these conditions you'll need to extend your glide path. Shorter runways leave less margin for error." "I know that," he snapped, his tone defensive. She didn't flinch, her calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm sure you do. I'm just making sure we're on the same page." The co-pilot cast a nervous glance between them, clearly uncomfortable with the undercurrent of tension. Monica decided to shift her focus back to the radar, giving Banks the space to work without feeling undermined. This wasn't about proving a point. It was about ensuring everyone on board landed safely. As they continued their descent, the turbulence began to pick up again. The plane shuddered, its frame groaning faintly as the winds fought against it. Monica could feel the pressure in her ears, a subtle reminder of the thin line between control and chaos. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but devoid of warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching our alternate landing site. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The crew will ensure everyone is prepared for landing." Monica glanced at the co-pilot, noting the beads of sweat on his forehead. "How's the secondary comms?" she asked, her tone measured. "Still intermittent," he replied, adjusting a dial on the panel. "We've managed to get through to the tower, but the connection keeps dropping." Monica frowned. Clear communication with the tower was critical during an approach like this. Without it, even the most experienced pilots could be left guessing. "Stay on it," she said, "and if it drops again, let me know." The co-pilot nodded, his hands moving deftly over the controls. Despite his nerves, Monica could see that he was capable, a good second in command. She just hoped his resolve would hold if the situation deteriorated further. The turbulence grew stronger as they neared the storm's edge, the plane dipping and swaying with each gust of wind. Passengers in the cabin clung to their armrests, their faces pale and tense. Monica could almost feel their collective fear pressing against her, a silent weight she carried as she focused on the task at hand. "We're coming up on the glide path," Banks announced, his voice clipped. Monica leaned forward, studying the radar and the faint outline of the alternate airport in the distance. The runway was visible now, a narrow strip of concrete surrounded by fields. It was a far cry from the sprawling runways of major airports, but it would have to do. "Keep your approach shallow," she advised. "The winds are strong, and you'll need as much control as possible." Banks shot her a look, his expression a mix of irritation and grudging respect. He adjusted the controls, his hands steady despite the turbulence. The plane dipped again, the nose tilting slightly as they aligned with the runway. Monica could feel the shift in air pressure, the subtle changes in the plane's behavior as it fought against the wind. This was the critical moment, the point where every decision, every adjustment, could mean the difference between a smooth landing and disaster. As they closed in on the runway, Monica's focus sharpened even further. She watched Banks's movements closely, her instincts ready to step in if necessary. But to his credit, he handled the approach with care, his adjustments precise and calculated. The landing gear deployed with a faint whine, the plane shuddering slightly as it prepared for touchdown. Monica could feel the tension in the cockpit, the collective breath held as they neared the ground. "Steady," she murmured, her voice low but firm. "You've got this." Banks didn't respond, but his hands tightened on the controls. The plane dipped lower, the runway rushing up to meet them. The winds fought against their descent, pushing and pulling with relentless force. But the aircraft held steady. Finally, with a faint screech of tires, the plane touched down. The impact was firm but controlled, the brakes engaging as they slowed to a steady roll. A collective sigh of relief filled the cabin, followed by scattered applause from the passengers. Monica leaned back, her body relaxing for the first time since she'd entered the cockpit. She glanced at Banks, whose shoulders sagged slightly as he exhaled. "Good work," she said quietly. Banks didn't respond immediately. He stared straight ahead, his hand still gripping the controls. When he finally turned to her, his expression was unreadable. "We'll talk about this later," he said, his tone neutral. Monica nodded, understanding the unspoken message. For now, they had landed safely, and that was all that mattered. But she knew the conversation wasn't over, not by a long shot. The engines whined softly as the plane rolled to a halt on the alternate runway. Outside, rain splattered against the windows, streaking the glass and blurring the lights of emergency vehicles waiting nearby. Monica remained seated in the cockpit, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her gaze steady. She could feel the weight of what had just transpired settling over the small space, a mixture of relief and tension that hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Captain Banks sat stiffly in the pilot's chair, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The co-pilot fidgeted nervously with his headset, his fingers adjusting dials that no longer needed attention. Monica could see the exhaustion etched into their faces, the strain of the flight evident in the tight lines around their eyes and the sheen of sweat on their brows. "Clearance to disembark has been granted," the co-pilot said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was subdued, almost apologetic. "Ground crews are ready." Monica stood slowly, her movements deliberate, as if to signal that she wasn't in a rush to leave. Her gaze lingered on the instrument panel, the flashing indicators a reminder of the chaos they had just navigated. She turned to Captain Banks, her expression unreadable. "You handled the approach well," she said evenly, her voice devoid of sarcasm or condescension. Banks's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed as if he wouldn't respond, his pride still a wall between them. But then he exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Thank you," he said, though the words came out begrudgingly. He still couldn't meet her eyes. Monica studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. She wasn't looking for his gratitude or approval, but she understood the importance of this moment, of acknowledging his effort, even if he couldn't yet acknowledge hers. The co-pilot rose from his seat, stepping aside to let Monica pass. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his tone carrying a hint of respect. I'm glad you were here. Things might have gone differently if you hadn't stepped in." Monica offered him a faint smile, her first since entering the cockpit. "You did your part," she said. "That's what matters." She stepped out into the main cabin, where the passengers were beginning to gather their belongings. The atmosphere was charged with nervous energy, a mix of relief and residual fear. Monica could feel the eyes on her as she walked down the aisle, the murmurs growing louder as recognition spread. "That's her," someone whispered. She went into the cockpit. "What was she doing up there?" another voice asked, tinged with curiosity and disbelief. Monica ignored the stares, her focus on reaching her seat to retrieve her bag. She moved with quiet purpose, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos of the flight. As she reached her row, the man across the aisle, the one who had smirked at her earlier, spoke up. "Hey," he said, his voice hesitant. "Were you helping the pilots?" Monica glanced at him briefly, her expression neutral. "Yes." The man's face reddened slightly, his earlier smugness replaced by a sheepish look. "I didn't realize," he began, then trailed off, unsure of how to finish. Monica didn't wait for him to find the words. She collected her bag and turned away, leaving him to wrestle with his own discomfort. She had neither the time nor the inclination to entertain his sudden change of heart. As she exited the plane, the cool night air hit her face, a refreshing contrast to the stifling tension inside. Emergency vehicles lined the tarmac, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the wet asphalt. A small group of airline officials stood nearby, their faces tight with concern. One of them, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a name tag that read Riley Regional Manager, stepped forward. Her eyes flicked to Monica, a mix of curiosity and urgency in her gaze. "Miss Carter?" Riley asked, her tone both questioning and respectful. Monica nodded. That's me. Riley's expression softened slightly. We've been informed that you assisted the crew during the flight. On behalf of the airline, I want to thank you for stepping in. We'll need a debrief, of course, but, well, it sounds like you made a significant impact. Monica's lips curved into a faint smile. I did what needed to be done, she said simply. Riley nodded, her respect evident. If you're willing, we'd like you to stay for a brief meeting with the crew. It won't take long. Monica agreed with a small nod. She wasn't one to shy away from accountability, and she knew this conversation was inevitable. Besides, it was an opportunity to set the record straight, not just for herself, but for every moment of doubt she had endured during the flight. The meeting took place in a quiet conference room within the airport terminal. The walls were bare, the fluorescent lighting casting a harsh glare over the polished table. Captain Banks and the co-pilot were already seated when Monica entered, their expressions guarded. Riley stood at the head of the table, a tablet in her hands, her professional demeanor firmly in place. Let's get straight to it, Riley began, her tone brisk but not unkind. Captain Banks, I'd like to hear your assessment of the situation. Banks cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly on the table. The turbulence was worse than expected, he said, his voice carefully measured. We encountered significant crosswinds and engine strain. Miss Carter offered her assistance during a critical moment. Monica raised an eyebrow at the careful phrasing, but said nothing, allowing him to continue. She provided valuable input, Banks admitted reluctantly, his gaze fixed on the table. Her experience was evident. Riley nodded, her expression thoughtful. Miss Carter, do you have anything to add? Monica leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. Only that I stepped in because it was clear the situation was escalating. I respect Captain Banks's authority, but my priority was the safety of everyone on board. I've spent over 2 decades flying under extreme conditions. I recognized the signs and acted accordingly. Riley studied her for a moment, then turned back to Banks. Captain, do you feel her involvement was warranted? There was a long pause, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Banks exhaled sharply. Yes, he said, his tone grudging but honest. She was right. The admission hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of Monica's expertise and the biases that had nearly cost them. Riley nodded, satisfied, and turned to Monica. Thank you, Miss Carter, she said, her tone warmer now. Your actions were exemplary. We'll ensure this incident is documented appropriately. Monica inclined her head, her composure intact. As the meeting concluded, she rose from her seat, feeling the weight of the evening begin to lift. She didn't need validation. Her actions spoke for themselves, but she appreciated the opportunity to set the record straight. As she stepped out into the terminal, the rain had stopped, leaving the tarmac glistening under the lights. Monica paused for a moment, taking in the quiet stillness of the night. She had faced storms before, both in the air and in life. This one was no different, and like always, she had emerged stronger. Captain Richard Banks stood near the glass wall of the airport terminal, his gaze fixed on the rain-soaked tarmac outside. The distant hum of ground crew activity filled the air, a faint backdrop to the storm raging in his mind. The meeting had ended nearly an hour ago, yet its weight lingered heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the image of Monica Carter sitting across from him, her calm confidence a sharp contrast to his own barely concealed frustration. For the first time in years, Banks felt something unfamiliar gnawing at him, a mixture of doubt and shame. He had always prided himself on his ability to command, to control every situation with precision and authority. But tonight, that control had slipped through his fingers, leaving him exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. He turned slightly at the sound of footsteps approaching. Monica Carter stood a few feet away, her posture relaxed yet purposeful. Her travel bag hung over one shoulder, her expression unreadable. Banks hesitated, unsure of what to say, the words tangling in his throat. Captain Banks, Monica began, her voice steady. I didn't mean to undermine you. I hope you understand that." Her directness caught him off guard. He cleared his throat, searching for the right response. "You didn't undermine me," he said slowly, the admission tasting bitter. "You stepped in when it was necessary." She nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Good, because this wasn't about authority. It was about the safety of everyone on that plane." Banks looked away, his gaze returning to the tarmac. "I know," he said quietly, "but that doesn't make it any easier to accept." Monica studied him for a moment, her keen eyes taking in the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands. She had seen this before, the aftermath of adrenaline, the weight of realizing how close things had come to disaster. It wasn't weakness, she knew, but the human side of a profession often shrouded in pride. "You did well on the landing," she said, her tone sincere. Under the circumstances, it was a solid approach. He glanced at her, surprised by the compliment. "You mean that?" "I don't say things I don't mean," she replied simply. "You kept your composure when it mattered. That's what counts." Her words settled over him like a balm, easing some of the tension he hadn't realized he was holding. He nodded slowly, his pride giving way to a grudging respect for the woman who had stepped into his domain and shown him what true leadership looked like. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Banks spoke, his voice quieter now. "You're retired military?" "Air Force," Monica confirmed. "I flew for over 20 years, fighter jets mostly, but I've logged plenty of hours in transport aircraft too." Banks let out a low whistle. "Fighter jets. That's impressive." She gave a faint smile. "It taught me a lot, about precision, about staying calm under pressure, and about working with people who don't always see eye to eye with you." The last part wasn't pointed, but Banks felt its weight nonetheless. He shifted his stance, his fingers brushing against the stripes on his uniform sleeve. "I'll admit," he said, his tone hesitant, "I didn't give you the benefit of the doubt. When you stepped into the cockpit, I assumed the worst." Monica didn't react immediately. She let the words hang in the air, giving him space to continue. "I was wrong," he said finally, the admission coming with visible effort. "You knew what you were doing. More than that, you had the courage to step up when it mattered. That's not something everyone can do." Her expression softened, but she didn't let him off the hook entirely. "Assumptions can be dangerous, Captain. In the air, they can get people killed. And down here, they close doors that should never have been shut." Banks nodded, the truth of her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've got some things to think about." Monica tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "We all do, but the important part is learning from it." He gave a faint, self-deprecating chuckle. "You sound like one of my old instructors." She smiled at that, a genuine warmth that eased the tension further. "Maybe I am, in a way." The conversation shifted after that, the initial awkwardness giving way to a tentative camaraderie. Banks found himself asking about her experiences in the Air Force, and Monica shared a few stories. Nothing too heavy, just enough to give him a glimpse of the life she had lived. Her calm, measured demeanor was the same as it had been in the cockpit, but now he saw the depth behind it, the resilience of someone who had faced challenges far greater than his own. By the time they parted ways, something had shifted between them. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a start, a foundation built on mutual respect and the shared understanding of what it meant to bear the weight of responsibility. As Monica walked away, Banks remained by the glass wall, watching her until she disappeared into the crowd. The rain had stopped, and the tarmac glistened under the bright airport lights. He stood there for a long time, his thoughts a tangle of regret and resolve. He knew he couldn't change the events of the night, but he could change what came next. And as he finally turned away, his steps heavy but determined, he made a silent vow to himself. He would do better, not just as a pilot but as a leader and as a man. Monica Carter stepped into the terminal lounge, her senses sharpening as she absorbed her surroundings. The cold, sterile lights of the airport illuminated the worn tile floors, and the faint hum of an espresso machine whirred in the background. Despite the stillness of the hour, there were pockets of life scattered across the space. Tired travelers huddled over coffee cups, a child clutching a stuffed bear as they dozed in their parents' arms, and a businesswoman typing furiously at her laptop. It was a scene she had seen countless times before, yet tonight, everything felt heavier. She found a quiet corner, her steps deliberate as she set her bag down and eased into the stiff leather chair. Her fingers rested on her lap, her mind replaying the evening's events in slow, deliberate fragments. The cockpit, the turbulence, the moment she stepped forward, not as a passenger but as a pilot. One who could not sit idly by when she knew her expertise could make a difference. Her calm had been genuine, but now, in the stillness of the lounge, Monica allowed herself to feel the exhaustion creeping into her bones. She had always carried herself with poise, knowing that any hint of vulnerability might invite judgment or doubt. But here, in this quiet space, she could let her guard down, even if just a little. Across the terminal, Captain Richard Banks remained near the glass wall, though his posture had softened. He had lingered after their conversation, watching Monica as she disappeared into the crowd. He hadn't expected her words to linger as they did, replaying in his mind with relentless clarity. "You did well on the landing," she had said, her voice steady yet unyielding. "But assumptions can close doors that should never be shut." Banks sighed, his reflection in the glass seeming to mock him. It wasn't just the flight or the turbulence that unsettled him. It was the realization that his own pride had nearly jeopardized the safety of everyone on board. He had always viewed himself as a capable leader, but tonight had shown him the cracks in his foundation. "Captain?" The voice startled him slightly, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to find one of the flight attendants, a young woman named Laura, standing nearby. Her expression was hesitant, as though she wasn't sure whether to approach. "Yes, Laura?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She stepped closer, her hands clasped in front of her. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "Are you all right? After everything?" Banks hesitated, surprised by the question. He wasn't used to his crew asking after his well-being. He had always been the one who was supposed to provide reassurance, not receive it. But the sincerity in Laura's eyes made him pause. "I'm fine," he said after a moment, though the words felt inadequate. "It's been a long night, but we made it through." She nodded, but her expression remained concerned. "Miss Carter, she was incredible," Laura said, her voice carrying a note of admiration. "I've never seen anyone step up like that. It was humbling." Banks felt a pang of something, shame, perhaps, or pride. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "She was." Laura hesitated, then gave him a faint smile. "If you need anything, Captain, let me know. We're all here for you." He nodded, his gratitude unspoken but genuine. As she walked away, he found himself glancing toward the direction Monica had gone. He wasn't sure why, but he felt the need to see her again, not to apologize further, but to acknowledge something deeper, something he hadn't fully understood before tonight. Monica sat with her back straight, her hands resting on the armrests of her chair as she stared out at the rain-slicked tarmac. Her mind wandered, sifting through memories of past flights, past decisions, and the countless moments that had shaped her into the woman she was today. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from her reverie. She turned slightly, surprised to see Banks standing a few feet away, his posture hesitant but determined. He looked different now, less rigid, more reflective. She gestured to the chair opposite her, inviting him to sit. He hesitated for only a moment before accepting, lowering himself into the seat. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, but charged with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. "I wanted to say something," Banks began finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "After everything that happened tonight, I've realized how much I have to learn." Monica tilted her head slightly, her expression neutral. Learning is a lifelong process, Captain, she said. No one gets it right every time. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. I've always thought of myself as a good leader, he admitted. But tonight I saw my own limits, and I saw what real leadership looks like. Her brows lifted slightly, but she remained silent, letting him continue. You didn't just take control when you stepped into that cockpit, he said. You brought clarity, confidence. You didn't hesitate, and because of that, we made it through. Monica leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. Leadership isn't about always having the answers, Captain. It's about recognizing when to trust the people around you. That's not weakness. It's strength. He met her gaze, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he nodded. You're right, he said, and I hope I can learn from that. Monica studied him, sensing the sincerity in his words. You will, she said simply, if you're willing to listen. Banks exhaled, a faint smile touching his lips. I think tonight taught me that I need to. The conversation drifted after that, the initial tension giving way to something quieter, more reflective. They spoke about the flight, about their shared experiences in the air, and even about the challenges they had faced in their respective careers. For the first time, Banks saw Monica not as an outsider, but as a peer, someone who understood the weight of responsibility as intimately as he did. When they finally rose to part ways, the rain outside had stopped, leaving the tarmac glistening under the terminal lights. Banks extended a hand, his grip firm but respectful. Thank you, Miss Carter, he said, his voice steady. Not just for tonight, but for the lesson. Monica shook his hand, her expression softening. Take it to heart, Captain, she said. And remember, every flight is a chance to do better. He nodded, her words settling over him like a quiet promise. As she walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the terminal's glow, Banks felt something shift within him. Tonight had been a reckoning, not just with the storm outside, but with the one inside himself. And he vowed that the man who had stood in that cockpit, hesitant and uncertain, would not be the man to step into the next. The flight may have landed safely, but the lessons learned that night continue to resonate. Monica Carter's strength and calm under pressure reminded everyone that true leadership is about trust, courage, and stepping up when it matters most. Stories like hers inspire us to see the power of resilience and the impact one person can make. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful and unforgettable tales. Don't forget to click the bell icon to stay updated. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.